The courtroom was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of a gavel. Judge Harold Bennett, a man known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach, adjusted his glasses and glanced at the woman standing before him. Maria Wells, with her calm composure and unwavering confidence, looked almost out of place in this small, conservative town's courthouse. She was being charged with refusing to disperse during a protest, a minor offense in the grand scheme of things, yet it had drawn the eyes of the media, with cameras capturing her every move. The protest itself had been peaceful, aimed at raising awareness of racial inequality and police brutality, but tensions ran high, and the streets had erupted into chaos in moments of anger. Judge Bennett glanced down at the case file in front of him. He skimmed through the details of her arrest. No previous criminal history, no sign of any violent intent. Just another protester in a long line of activists trying to make a statement. Or so he thought. He had presided over many cases like this before, cases where activists came and went, their impact fleeting. To him, it was simply a matter of holding people accountable for their actions. Maria stood tall, her dark eyes focused and calm, her expression unreadable. There was no defiance in her posture, no hint of nervousness. It was as if she had already accepted the outcome of the case, whatever it might be. But her serenity wasn't lost on the judge. It only made him more curious about her, though he didn't quite understand why. He wasn't accustomed to seeing protesters so composed, and certainly not in such a high-profile case. The judge cleared his throat and addressed the court. "Ms. Wells, you were caught in a protest that turned chaotic. You chose to stay despite the police order to disperse, and now you face a fine for disrupting the peace. What do you have to say in your defense?" Maria's voice was soft but firm as she spoke. "Your Honor, I was standing for justice. The protest was peaceful. We were exercising our right to speak out against injustices that affect all of us. I didn't disrupt anything. I stood still. Sometimes, standing still is the most powerful action you can take." Her words, though measured, struck a chord in the room, yet Judge Bennett was unmoved. He had seen it all before. The speeches, the idealism. He had a duty to uphold the law, and he intended to do so. Without further ado, he issued a fine that seemed as routine as any other, though the eyes of the room were still on Maria. As she accepted the fine, her gaze met his for just a moment. Something in her eyes lingered, a quiet resolve that unsettled him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a protester in his courtroom. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something about Maria Wells that felt different. The story of Maria Wells didn't fade after the courtroom. In fact, the opposite happened. The media coverage surrounding her trial exploded. The headlines painted a picture of a determined woman at the forefront of a new wave of activism. Her face, calm and composed despite the charges, became synonymous with the larger struggle for justice. People from all walks of life began to share her name, but not for the reasons Judge Harold Bennett expected. Maria's arrest during the protest, though seemingly minor, sparked something much bigger. News outlets across the country ran segments about the ongoing protests for racial equality and police reform, and her image became one of the focal points. "Who is this woman?" one reporter asked on live television. "What makes her different from the thousands of other protesters?" Judge Bennett, still certain that Maria was just another activist trying to make a point, dismissed the attention as nothing more than media sensationalism. To him, her role in the protest was just a blip on the radar. What did a fine matter in the grand scheme of things? After all, plenty of people had walked through his courtroom for similar offenses, but none had garnered this much attention. He didn't think much of it until a colleague in the legal community mentioned her name in passing. "You know, Judge," the colleague remarked, "you've just fined one of the most influential voices in the military reform movement right now. Maria Wells is not just a protester. She's leading the charge on a global scale. Her work is reshaping military policy everywhere from Washington to the Middle East." The words hit the judge like a splash of cold water. He paused, disbelief crossing his face. This was the same woman who had stood before him so calm and composed just days before, the same woman he'd written off as another protester. A quick search on his tablet brought up more details. Maria Wells was indeed more than just a protester. She had been quietly revolutionizing military operations for years. Maria, as it turned out, was not just an activist on the streets. She was a strategist, a leader shaping the future of military strategy on a global scale. Her initiatives, focused on integrating human rights, diversity, and a focus on peacekeeping, had led to groundbreaking reforms in military training and operations. She had been working closely with the federal government, advising top officials on how to make the U.S. military more inclusive and focused on global stability. In fact, many of her proposals had already been implemented in various countries. Judge Bennett's mind raced. The woman who had been before him in that courtroom was no ordinary activist. She was someone who had power, influence, and the kind of vision that could change the world. He found himself suddenly embarrassed by the fine he had issued. But more than that, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible misjudgment. The more he learned, the more he realized that Maria Wells wasn't just leading a movement. She was the movement itself. Maria Wells was not what the judge or the public thought she was. While the world saw her as just another face in the protest crowd, the truth was far more complex. Beneath the calm exterior, she was a highly skilled military strategist who had been quietly rewriting the playbook for military operations on a global scale. Her influence stretched far beyond the protests and demonstrations she participated in, and it was reshaping the way armies operated across the world. Maria had spent years building a reputation in the shadows, working with top military leaders and government officials to create reforms that prioritized humanitarian values over traditional warfare tactics. She believed that the military, for too long, had been focused on power and dominance. Instead, she pushed for a new vision, one where peacekeeping, equality, and justice were at the forefront of military action. Her efforts had already borne fruit in several countries. She had played a central role in advising the U.S. Department of Defense on overhauling the training programs for soldiers, shifting their focus from combat readiness to conflict resolution and cultural sensitivity. Her groundbreaking work had been instrumental in ensuring that military units worldwide operated with more accountability and transparency. But it wasn't just the U.S. that had taken note of Maria's influence. Governments in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East had sought her expertise, implementing reforms she had championed in their own armed forces. It wasn't just about military tactics, it was about building an entirely new framework for how the military could serve society in a more responsible, ethical way. Her influence had also extended to NATO, where she had worked on initiatives aimed at fostering collaboration between member nations in areas such as disaster relief, humanitarian aid, and global peacekeeping operations. Her strategic vision had begun to take shape across borders, and while the changes were gradual, they were undeniable. Maria's ability to remain behind the scenes, working tirelessly to shift the tides of military culture, made her a formidable figure. She was a woman who had transcended the role of traditional activist. Her impact wasn't just about rallying crowds or making speeches, it was about laying the groundwork for long-term systemic change. Back in the courtroom, Judge Bennett still struggled to fully grasp the extent of Maria's role in the world. He had once seen her as nothing more than another face in the sea of protesters. But now, the more he learned, the more he realized how much he had underestimated her. Her ability to quietly wield power while maintaining a calm presence in the face of adversity was something he couldn't ignore. What struck him most was her unwavering conviction. She had been a beacon of change long before anyone had ever recognized her for it. And now, as the full scope of her influence became clear to him, he couldn't help but wonder what would have happened had he known the truth when she stood before him in his courtroom. The story of Maria Wells didn't just fade away after the courtroom drama. It escalated. The media frenzy that had surrounded her arrest began to take on a life of its own. News outlets, both local and national, dug deeper into her background, revealing her hidden role as a key player in military reforms that were sweeping across the globe. Social media lit up with hashtags and posts, as people who had once dismissed her as just another protester began to rethink their initial judgments. It wasn't long before Mariah's name became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of strategic change. Protesters, activists, and civilians alike began to rally behind her, seeing her as someone who was not only fighting for justice in the streets, but also making tangible, lasting changes to the very systems that had perpetuated inequality. The hashtag Maria Wells Reform began trending, with people sharing articles, videos, and personal stories of how her work was impacting lives, both in and outside of military circles. On the other side of the coin, there were those who saw her influence as a threat. Some military officials felt uncomfortable with her progressive ideas, fearing that her reforms might weaken their control or shift the very foundation of their power. Critics in the conservative media painted her as an outsider trying to undermine the traditional values of the armed forces, but what they didn't understand was that Maria wasn't attempting to dismantle the military. She was attempting to evolve it, to ensure that it served a world that was increasingly interconnected and in need of peace, not aggression. Despite the backlash, Maria's efforts were undeniable. Countries around the world were beginning to implement her strategies, moving away from heavy-handed tactics and towards a more human-centered approach to conflict resolution. She had influenced countries in Europe to shift their focus from military might to peacekeeping missions in unstable regions. In Africa, her work had led to better coordination of resources for disaster relief and the protection of civilians caught in the crossfire of war. Even in the Middle East, where tensions had been high for decades, Mariah's ideas were slowly being integrated into military training programs, focusing on diplomacy, cultural understanding, and de-escalation. Back in the courtroom, Judge Bennett was struggling with the new information he had uncovered about Mariah. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of discomfort. How had he, a figure of authority, missed the full scope of her work? How had he failed to see that the woman standing before him was not just another activist, but someone who was shaping the future of global military policy? His mistake in issuing the fine had seemed insignificant at first, but now it felt like a glaring misstep. He had dismissed her too easily, too quickly. As public support for Maria grew, the pressure on the legal system intensified. People were calling for the fine to be overturned, demanding that the justice system recognize the profound work she was doing. Judge Bennett knew the calls for change were getting louder, and as he watched the world rally behind her, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he needed to make things right. But how? The answer seemed clear, yet it felt more complicated than simply admitting his mistake. The landscape was shifting, and he had to decide whether he would be part of the old guard or step into a future that was quickly unfolding before him. As the days passed, Judge Harold Bennett couldn't escape the growing realization that he had made a monumental mistake. The more he read about Maria Wells, the more he understood how little he had known about the woman who had stood before him in his courtroom. It was as though he had dismissed her with a mere flick of his gavel, never pausing to consider who she really was or the far-reaching impact she had already made. At first, the judge had tried to brush it off. After all, he had simply done his job, hadn't he? He had fined a protester who had defied an order from law enforcement. It was routine. But now, with each new article he read, each new expert or military official he spoke with, the truth was becoming undeniable. Maria wasn't just another activist. She was an architect of change, a leader with a vision that was reshaping military policies and international relations. It began with a phone call from one of his colleagues, a fellow judge who had worked with the Department of Defense. "Harold," the colleague said with an edge of disbelief in his voice, "you've got to be kidding me. You fined Maria Wells." The tone was one of both surprise and reprimand, and it caught Bennett off guard. "She's not just some protester you can dismiss," his colleague continued. "She's spearheading major military reforms worldwide. I'm talking about her role in transforming how armed forces handle conflict resolution, diversity, and even peacekeeping missions. You've got to read up on her work. She's changing the way the world sees military power." The conversation hit Bennett hard. For the first time, he began to grasp the magnitude of Mariah's influence. He quickly dove into researching her work, how she had helped transform military training programs in the U.S., urging them to focus on de-escalation tactics and cultural awareness. He learned about her strategic involvement in advising NATO and foreign governments, advocating for peace-building efforts instead of forceful intervention. The more he uncovered, the more he felt a sense of deep regret. He had assumed, based solely on her appearance and the nature of her arrest, that Mariah was simply another face in a crowd of activists. Yet, in reality, she was one of the most influential and strategic minds in military reform. His mistake, he realized, wasn't just about finding her. It was about misunderstanding the complexity of her role in the world. Bennett spent nights reading articles, interviews, and policy papers that detailed her work. Each new piece of information made him feel more uncomfortable with his previous actions. He had been blinded by his own narrow perspective of justice, failing to recognize the full scope of her contributions. The more he reflected, the more he realized he had been a part of the very system Mariah was working to change. And now he knew he had to make things right. But how? He couldn't undo the fine, but he could use his platform to support her work, to make sure the world understood who she really was. It was time for the judge to reconcile with the truth, and it was time for Mariah Wells to be recognized for the leader she truly was. Judge Harold Bennett's world had shifted in the days following his realization about Mariah Wells. The more he reflected on his initial decision, the more the weight of his mistake pressed down on him. He had dismissed her as just another protester, issuing a fine without considering the broader implications of her actions or the magnitude of her contributions. His actions had been hasty, based on assumptions rather than facts. And now, the public was aware of just how wrong he had been. The news about his fine, and its eventual public scrutiny, spread like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with conversations about how a judge had penalized a woman who was helping lead transformative military reforms worldwide. Supporters of Mariah rallied behind her, demanding that the fine be overturned. Critics of the judge lambasted him for his ignorance and insensitivity toward a figure who was reshaping global military policy. It wasn't just public outrage that weighed on Bennett. His colleagues, both in the legal world and in the military, had made it clear that his actions were problematic. A former colleague who had served in the Pentagon called him up. "You can't let this go. People are starting to look at you, Harold. You can either dig in your heels and maintain the status quo, or you can make this right." The words struck him deeply. He had always prided himself on being fair and objective, but now he saw the truth. His lack of awareness had been a failure of both his duty as a judge and as a citizen. The case wasn't just about a protest. It was about recognizing the broader impact of one individual's work in shaping the future. Mariah Wells was leading the charge for systemic change, and he had played a small, unhelpful role in standing against it. That's when Bennett knew what he had to do. He needed to make a public statement, not just to apologize, but to acknowledge the true nature of Mariah's work. It was a bold move, one that he had never anticipated making. But it felt necessary, and he couldn't let the moment pass. The next day, before the press conference even began, he released a written statement that would soon go viral. It read, "In my capacity as a judge, I made an error in judgment regarding Ms. Mariah Wells. Upon further reflection, I have come to understand the immense value of her work in military reform, and I regret the oversight I made in both assessing her actions and her broader impact. Ms. Wells is not just an activist, but a global leader whose work is transforming military policy and international relations. I was wrong to penalize her, and I sincerely apologize for my actions." The words were carefully chosen, but they came from a place of genuine regret. Bennett knew that an apology alone wasn't enough. It was a starting point. He would continue to speak out in support of Mariah's mission, using his position to amplify the importance of her work and the need for systemic change. When the press conference took place, Bennett stood before the cameras, his face serious but sincere. He addressed the public, acknowledging his mistake and expressing his commitment to learning from it. "I made a mistake," he said, "but I'm here today to correct it." Maria Wells is a leader of extraordinary vision. We need more people like her. Maria, though grateful for the apology, remained focused on the work at hand, but the judge's words were a step towards something larger, a shift in perspective, both in the court of law and in society at large. In the wake of Judge Bennett's public apology, the pressure on the legal system to reassess Maria Wells' fine became too great to ignore. The media attention had only intensified after the judge's statements, and the public's demand for accountability had reached a boiling point. A wave of support flooded in for Maria, with people from all walks of life rallying behind her and calling for the legal system to right the wrong that had been done. Protesters once again filled the streets, but this time, they weren't just protesting for justice on behalf of the marginalized. They were also rallying for Maria specifically, demanding that the fine be overturned. Her supporters argued that the charges against her were not only unjust, but also a symbolic attempt to stifle someone whose work was deeply beneficial to society. The backlash against the fine had become a catalyst for a much larger conversation, one about the role of the judicial system in holding accountable not just individuals, but institutions that perpetuated systemic injustices. Within the courthouse, there was a palpable shift. The atmosphere had changed. Judge Bennett, having taken the first step by admitting his mistake, now had to face the practical realities of the situation. The pressure mounted, and a legal review of Maria's case was initiated. It wasn't just about reversing a fine anymore. It was about acknowledging the broader implications of Maria's role in reforming military operations and global peacekeeping strategies. Months passed before the hearing was scheduled, but when the time came, the courtroom was filled with people eager to see what would happen next. The scene was very different from the one that had unfolded months before. There were no cameras this time, no courtroom drama. This was about making things right. The room was quieter, as if everyone knew the significance of the moment. Maria entered the courtroom, not as a defendant, but as someone whose voice had reverberated far beyond the walls of this small legal space. Judge Bennett, now deeply aware of the weight of his earlier decision, took his place at the bench. His demeanor had changed, no longer the detached authority figure, but someone who understood the importance of accountability and reconciliation. "Ms. Wells," the judge began, his voice steady but filled with newfound respect. "The fine I imposed upon you was a mistake. After much reflection and careful review of the facts, I now recognize the tremendous work you have done in advancing global military reforms, promoting peace and fostering equality. It is clear to me that your actions were part of a larger movement that has only just begun to bear fruit." Maria stood silently, her face calm, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, a sense of quiet vindication, but also a deep understanding that this was not her victory alone. This was a collective triumph for the many people who had been working alongside her to push for change. "I have asked the court to reverse the fine and acknowledge the role you've played in shaping military policy worldwide," Judge Bennett continued. "Your actions were not only just, they were necessary." The gavel came down with a resounding thud, and the case was officially reversed. The fine was nullified, but it was more than just a legal victory. It was a moment of symbolic justice, a moment that reflected the growing recognition of Maria's work and the need for the legal system to evolve alongside the changes she was helping to usher in. As she left the courtroom, the crowd that had gathered outside cheered. It wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for those who believed in the power of peaceful change, the importance of leadership, and the need for the world to adapt to a new, more inclusive future. With the case behind her and the fine officially overturned, Maria Wells found herself in a new chapter of her journey. The reversal of the fine was more than just a legal victory. It was a powerful symbol of transformation. Her leadership, both on the streets and behind the scenes, was now being fully recognized, not only in public opinion but within the very institutions that had once underestimated her. The media, once quick to label her as just another protester, now hailed her as a global changemaker. Her work, which had already been shaping military policies around the world, took on new visibility. As Maria spoke at forums, military conferences, and international peacebuilding summits, she began to form new partnerships with key figures in both government and civil society, individuals who had long been skeptical of her vision, but who now saw the incredible potential in the changes she was advocating for. Among these new allies was Judge Harold Bennett. After his public apology and the legal reversal, he had taken a hard look at his role in the justice system. He realized that while his past judgments have been based on his understanding of the law, he had often failed to account for the larger, evolving issues at play. It wasn't just about following protocol. It was about recognizing the deeper forces of societal change, and the fact that justice should serve that change, not obstruct it. Though Maria's work had always been rooted in military reform, she had begun speaking out about the need for judicial reform as well. As she worked alongside international leaders to reshape how military operations were approached, focusing on peace, diplomacy, and human rights, she realized that systemic reform didn't stop with the military. The justice system itself needed to evolve. Bennett, having been on the receiving end of his own humbling, became an unexpected advocate for Maria's broader goals. His legal experience, once limited to the confines of the courtroom, now served as a bridge between Maria's vision and the legal reforms she was calling for. The two began to work together, developing ideas for how the judicial system could be more adaptable to the shifting dynamics of the world. A world where the lines between military and civilian life were increasingly blurred, and where the fight for justice required a more nuanced, progressive approach. Their partnership was groundbreaking. Maria's global influence on military policy was undeniable, but Judge Bennett's support brought credibility and an institutional understanding that opened doors for broader legislative changes. They worked with lawmakers, other judges, and military leaders to create frameworks that allowed for greater transparency, accountability, and fairness, both within the military and in how the legal system interacted with those affected by it. The duo, unlikely as it was, became a symbol of the future, proof that even entrenched systems could evolve when individuals were willing to learn, adapt, and work together for a common cause. As Maria's work continued to reach new heights, the seeds of change she had planted, both in the military and in the courtroom, began to take root. The world was watching, and Maria Wells, alongside Judge Bennett, was helping to lead the way. Their collaboration was not just a powerful partnership, it was a living testament to the idea that true reform required not just changing the system, but also changing the hearts and minds of those within it.